and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share a one-of-a-kind story sent in from a subscriber who had an experience like none I have ever heard before. And upon doing some research, I could only find one story remotely similar. This story comes to us from Annie, who was protected by a white wolf from something lurking in the forest one night. I would like to thank Annie for sharing her story with me and allowing me to share it with you. Before we get started, I just want to say that a lot of people turn to posting their stories online because they feel like they can't tell anyone and would be seen as crazy if they did. Most people who experience these beings are traumatized and feel the need to unburden themselves or just have someone who will believe them listen to their story. If you've had an encounter and you feel like you can't tell anyone for fear of being made fun of, ridiculed, called a liar, or any other reason, email me. You'll find a sympathetic ear here who will believe you. I do want to mention that just because you email me your story, it doesn't mean it will end up in an episode on my channel. Your story can stay between me and you if that's what you want. Also, if you've had an encounter and you'd like to come on an episode and tell your story, email me. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. Alright, let's get into today's stories. Annie begins her story by saying that she grew up in a time when the paranormal wasn't a mainstream topic of conversation. She had to keep quiet about her encounters, carrying them around as a traumatic, dirty little secret. She believed this is why she became so intrigued by the world of the paranormal and cryptids. This particular story she had been carrying around for 36 years, all the while searching for people with similar encounters to hers. She had sought answers about what exactly happened to her and never found an exact encounter matching her own. She had only ever discovered one encounter that resembled hers and a legend from the First Nations people of Canada and Alaska that might explain what she had experienced. She sent her story in hoping that someone who heard it might have gone through something similar, so she could finally understand what happened to her all those years ago. Annie grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and spent every summer in a cabin in the woods of New Hampshire. She stayed there almost the entire summer each year, and she absolutely loved it. She felt such peace and freedom running barefoot through the woods, exploring and becoming one with nature. Some days she woke up in the morning, packed food and drinks, and stayed out until nightfall. On other days, she and her grandmother would go on walks picking wild berries and flowers. Her grandmother had taught her about which plants and fruits were edible and safe and which ones were not. Her grandmother always told her stories and legends she had been told as a child in Ireland. Her grandmother taught her to respect the world around her, both the seen and unseen. She believed in paranormal entities, cryptids, and the fae folk, recounting tales about all of them. While she wasn't a superstitious woman, she strongly believed in trusting instincts and remaining aware of the world. Their cabin in New Hampshire sat in a very rural area on a small hill surrounded on three sides by woods. In front of the house was a lake. Her bedroom was in the back of the house and had a door leading to the backyard. 3 steps leading from the back door descended into a narrow stretch of grass that bordered the White Mountains. She had a lot of freedom exploring the woods as a child, but certain days felt distinctly wrong. On those quote off days, the air seemed heavy and unease filled her. She felt watched. On those days, she wasn't allowed to venture into the woods alone and had to remain visible to her parents or grandmother at all times. Her grandmother, she remembers, was especially nervous and on edge during those days. The day her encounter happened was during one of the off days. She was 11 years old and remembers sitting on the front porch trying to read a book. However, she couldn't concentrate due to an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Looking around, she saw nothing, yet the feeling persisted. Frustrated, she gave up and went inside, despite it being a perfect summer day. She stayed indoors all day. By nightfall, she prepared for bed around 10 p.m., leaving the back door open with the screen door latched to cool the room. She woke up around 2 or 2:30 in the morning and looked around. Outside the screen door, she saw a huge, pure white wolf. It was larger than any wolf she had ever seen and was so white that it almost glowed. Not a single speck of dirt marred its coat, and its piercing blue eyes were like ice, almost white. It was the most beautiful animal she had ever encountered. She got out of bed and walked toward the back door. Though the wolf didn't speak or communicate telepathically, she knew with certainty it wanted her to go outside. Somehow she instinctively understood and complied. She went out and sat on the top step, and the wolf sat down beside her. She stroked its fur like a domesticated dog while talking to it. Though she couldn't recall everything she said, it was along the lines of admiring its beauty and expressing happiness at its visit. She noticed that the top part of this wolf's coat was coarse, while the fur underneath was incredibly soft. Leaning against her, the wolf stayed by her side for 10 to 15 minutes. During this time, she realized how unnaturally quiet the woods had become. The usual cacophony of nocturnal sounds were absent, leaving an eerie silence in its stead. Suddenly, she heard rustling in the woods ahead. Sticks snapped and something moved through the vegetation. She looked at the wolf, whose gaze was locked on the trees. Though she couldn't see what it was, she again instinctively knew she was in danger and that the wolf wanted her to go indoors. Following this silent instruction, she retreated inside, locking both the screen door and the solid door behind her. She watched from the window as the wolf bolted into the woods at an astonishing speed. Moments later, growling, snapping, and other sounds emerged. One from another, quote, voice as she described it, growling and screeching. This lasted mere moments, yet it felt like an eternity to her. Then she heard a blood-chilling screech. It was indescribable, a mix of high-pitched and low-pitched tones defying any animal recording she listened to afterward. To this day, she didn't know what had stalked her that night. Though she never saw it, she had a theory. Earlier, she mentioned the First Nations legend of a white wolf protecting people from a Wendigo. The New England and Canadian regions had long been hotspots for Wendigo encounters. While she couldn't confirm whether that's what was lurking in those woods that night, it remains her theory. She shared her counter with me in hopes that someone in my audience had experienced something similar. More importantly, she wanted anyone who had ever encountered a creature that wasn't supposed to exist to feel less alone. She encourages people to reach out with questions, clarifications, or similar encounters. In her view, the world wasn't as people perceive, and understanding it was crucial for safety. In a follow-up email, Annie shared the story that was similar to hers that she heard on another YouTube channel. In the video, the man recounted his encounter with a wolf from when he was younger. He had been about 14 years old at the time, living in the woods of Maine. His cat had gone missing and a bad snowstorm was about to hit. He wanted to find his cat before the weather turned, so he and his sister went into the woods to search for her. The storm began while they were searching, and it quickly grew intense. He said he felt as though he was being watched, and that was when he realized they were lost in the woods. Suddenly, a huge wolf appeared out of nowhere and began speaking to him telepathically. The wolf told him they were in danger and needed to get home as quickly as possible, because dangerous creatures were stalking them in the woods. The wolf then led them safely out of the forest. There was more to the encounter, but she couldn't remember all the details as it had been a few years since she heard the story. She reached out to the YouTube channel shortly after because the man's encounter was so similar to her own. It had taken place in the same area and they had been similar ages. The main difference was that her encounter had happened in the summer, while his occurred in winter, and the wolf had communicated telepathically with him, whereas hers had been more of a feeling, for lack of a better term. Upon talking to the owner of the YouTube channel, she discovered he was part Irish and part Native American. She is 100% Irish herself, and the conversation brought back a story her grandmother had told her about the dog soldiers of Ireland. The legend dated back to the 1300s in Ireland. It describes certain men and clans who were given the gift of shape-shifting and transformed into dogmen-like creatures to protect Ireland's lands and people. Her nan had also mentioned a book about the dog soldiers being stolen and later found in Canada. However, that was an entirely different topic. The similarities in their encounters made her wonder whether their Irish heritage had something to do with their experiences. She had no definitive answers, but she couldn't help but wonder if their encounters were tied to them being Irish. For my thoughts on this story, I will share what I told Annie. This is such an incredible story. It's the first I've heard involving a wolf guardian. I fully believe the wolf was sent there to protect her from whatever was lurking in that forest. It could have been a Wendigo, but they're usually only seen during winter. Not saying it wasn't one, and I'm not one to stick to hard and fast rules for these beings we know very little about, like some people do and say Wendigo encounters only happen in winter, but according to Algonquin legend and lore, that's when they are normally seen. What she described about her days that felt off during her stay in New Hampshire matches with other cryptid encounters. Feeling like she was being watched, the ominous and/or foreboding feeling, and everyone being on edge. Those are all common in cryptid encounters. One thing that stuck out to me is when she mentioned that on those days she wasn't allowed to go into the woods alone and had to stay where someone could see her at all times. This makes me think that her parents and/or her grandmother knew something was out there and perhaps could have seen something themselves. Or maybe they just felt off like she did on those days and knew something wasn't right. I wondered if she had ever questioned them about it or if they had ever had any encounters or experiences like she did. It really makes me wonder, being that they kept such a close watch on her on those off days. As far as her encounter tying into her being Irish, that could very well be the case. But if this thing was a Wendigo, which is based in Native American and First Nation legend and lore, it could just be a coincidence. However, I'm not much one for coincidence. As for the wolf, I couldn't find anything on the dog soldiers of Ireland when I researched the white wolf. That part of the story could absolutely have to do with her being Irish, with the wolf showing up to protect her. I also saw where in Native American mythology wolves are seen as spiritual guides and guardians. Being that these creatures could have been a Wendigo, which is based in Native American lore, the wolf could have shown up to protect her in that aspect. It also could very well have been her guardian angel in the form of a wolf. There are many accounts in the Bible where angels fight demons, good versus evil, as it seems to be in the case of her encounter. I have always believed that there is a demonic quality to many of the Native American legends, especially including the Wendigo. In any case, I'm just glad the wolf showed up when it did, because there's no telling what might have happened with this creature lurking around out there with nothing standing between it and her but a screen door. In my research, I only found one other story where someone encountered a large white wolf. A man talked about going on walks at 3 a.m. and was accompanied by a large white wolf each night. It makes me wonder if it was there to protect him from something. He didn't mention feeling like he was being watched or anything like that, just that the wolf was there each night. In her response to my email, Annie said that she had to admit the entire time she was with the wolf, she felt absolutely content. She wasn't afraid at all. Rather, she experienced complete peace in its presence. Although she found it odd that she never questioned why the wolf was there or why this wild animal allowed her to be near it, acting so docile. That part puzzled her, especially since her grandmother had instilled in her a healthy respect for wildlife from a young age. Her grandmother had taught her never to run from a wild animal because prey runs, but to always maintain a safe distance. It wasn't the wild animals necessarily wanted to harm anyone, but their nature made them unpredictable. So looking back, she was quite surprised at how at ease she felt around the wolf. Interestingly, the only story she had ever heard that resembled her own experience was the one I spoke of earlier about the man in Maine. She had never questioned her parents or grandmother about the days that felt strange. It seemed like an unspoken understanding. The locals all knew about these days and would warn families like hers about them, explaining what to do. People discussed it whenever it occurred, and it was a well-known secret, at least in her community. Her family simply referred to them as, quote, bad days, because of course they weren't paranormal. They were just bad days, something that happened, and you'd hope that the next day would be better. She didn't know whether her parents had any encounters similar to hers. Back then, things were different. Paranormal experiences weren't mainstream. They were like a dirty little secret that nobody talked about. That was simply how it was. The only person who was comfortable discussing the paranormal was her grandmother. Coming from Ireland, her grandmother had grown up in a culture where the paranormal was more accepted. Annie went on to say that she has experienced other encounters herself. In fact, she sometimes felt like a beacon for the paranormal. She has a theory that having one paranormal or cryptid experience opens a person up to have more, and that being, quote, open made the paranormal or cryptid world more drawn to them. Of course, she says, that's just her theory. She goes on to say that she's familiar with Wendigo legends, which often associate the Wendigo with the cold. None of the legends she knew explicitly stated that they only appeared in winter. However, she says she can't speak for Wendigo legends from other regions as she wasn't as familiar with them. She wasn't definitively claiming that this thing that night was a Wendigo because she truly didn't know. She hadn't seen it, only heard it. For my thoughts about this part of the story, I will share what I wrote back to Annie. It's pretty amazing how she could feel the safety and comfort she did sitting next to a wild animal like that. However, I don't think it was just an animal, as I've previously discussed. But she wouldn't have known that at the time. Maybe her grandmother teaching her to have respect for animals has something to do with why she didn't think twice about going out and sitting down next to a wolf. It's like she said, they are unpredictable, so there's no telling what could have happened if this quote animal had been a normal wolf. There probably would have at least been some apprehension on her part about going out there with it. I also grew up in a time when paranormal things were something you didn't talk about and weren't publicly accepted. There was a stigma about them. It was also a time when Sasquatch was restricted to the Pacific Northwest and was just an unidentified, undiscovered species of wild ape. So it makes sense that even if they did have an encounter or saw something, their parents didn't talk about it or about the off days being nothing more than that, just off days. I completely agree with her theory about opening the door to the paranormal, and once having an encounter, you become a beacon of sorts. It opens you up to more encounters. There is a way to slam that door shut, though. I found that out through my own personal experience, and that is with the name of Jesus. I banished a demon from my home using his name about 4.5 years ago and haven't had a problem since. In her second email, Annie also asked me what I thought about the wolf telepathically communicating with the boy in Maine, and this is what I told her. I'm not one bit surprised that the wolf encountered by the boy in Maine communicated with him telepathically. I see it all the time in cryptid encounters and other types of stories as well. These beings, time and time again, have communicated with people telepathically, and it isn't just these creatures either. We've talked about religion, and telepathic communication happens there too. There is much more of a supernatural element to this world than what people want to believe. What do you think about Annie's story? And what do you think the white wolf actually was? If you have any ideas, theories, or if you've experienced something similar, she'd love to hear about it, so put it in the comments below. I would again like to thank Annie for sharing her story with me and allowing me to share it with you. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put my email in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use your story in an episode. Even if you'd prefer I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. Also, if you'd like to come on an episode and tell your own story, email me. Please remember to keep it civil in the comment section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.